Morning, people. It's been an interesting week for racism because Dawn Butler is developing this really weird habit of saying stuff, getting told off for it, and then having her words proven 100% true later. We saw it when Dawn Butler was kicked out of Parliament for calling Boris Johnson a liar, and then 2 years later, he was kicked out of Parliament for being a liar. Fortunately, this time, she only had to wait a week. Now, here's the interview that's got the right wing of the UK up in arms against Dawn Butler. She's talking about the denial of the existence of racism with journalist and presenter James O'Brien.
When you talk about racism, people become defensive, they put walls up, it's an immediate, I'm not racist, or you're always talking about racism, I'm the one with the problem, I've got a chip on my shoulder. So I talk about women because it seems like people accept that difference more readily. So I say, if you've got a woman who's beaten and bruised and she's talking about domestic abuse and domestic violence, and you've got another woman who says, I've never suffered any form of violence in a relationship at all. The fact is that a woman is killed every 3 days by a man, by a partner or former partner. So why would you believe the woman who says domestic violence doesn't exist? And it's exactly the same with racism.
Of course it
Just
is.
because you've got a black person who says racism doesn't exist, why would you believe that black person over a black person that's telling you racism does exist?
Now, before we go on, she shouldn't have to do that, but I find myself doing the same thing. When I'm trying to explain concepts like white privilege, I find myself having to switch the topic away from race to get certain people to understand. Because they either use the standard argument of, but working class white people aren't privileged, to which the answer is, yes, but a working class black person would have a harder time getting a job to escape poverty than a working class white person. And the studies already show that employer bias is the reason for that. Or they do the most common thing, which is to get offended at the word privilege as if it's an insult. So what I have to do is point out my own privileges, like male privilege, which includes being able to walk down a dark alley at night and not being scared what's in my drink at a bar, and not being discriminated against by employers on the basis of my potential pregnancy. Or there's the privilege of having middle class parents, because I accept that going to private school gave me certain advantages. But the problem is that these right-wingers don't understand that there are two types of privilege. There's privilege that believes it deserves it, and privilege that knows it doesn't. I don't deserve any of the advantages that I've had in my life, but having those advantages doesn't make me a bad person. Having those advantages but not doing what I can to help those who are suffering because they don't have those advantages, that would make me a bad person. The reason these people get offended when you point out their privilege is because they know that they have no intention of fixing the status quo. They like things just as they are, which makes pointing out their privilege a moral insult to them. Now, the argument that I just made about class and gender, you can see how that'd be much more effective at persuading right-wingers than strictly sticking to race. But why is that? It's almost as if whiteness, unlike any other characteristic, holds this special, untouchable position within the public discourse, an almost supreme position. I'm sure there's a word for that kind of supremacy that won't trigger right-wingers. But on the point that Dawn Butler was making, her example of the woman who hasn't been abused to illustrate the kind of people who deny the existence of such abuse is perfect. When I talk about this, I call it Kanye syndrome, because how could Kanye West, a black man, support Donald Trump, a man so racist he had the explicit backing of the Ku Klux Klan? Why was he saying stuff like slavery was a choice? For me, it's that because he's so rich and powerful, and that, if anything, his blackness has market value to him as part of his brand, he sees himself as beyond the struggles of most black people. He's not being stopped in the street by police, he's not struggling to get a job because his name sounds too ethnic, he's not struggling to be heard in the workplace. So just like the woman who hasn't been abused, denying that such abuse exists, him denying the struggles of black people and supporting a man who promoted hate against all minorities, he didn't see that coming back to bite him. And I know that from personal experience, as does anybody who grew up as an ethnic minority in their school. You learn from an early age that your survival, your popularity, depends on your ability to let shit slide. Including racist stuff, and even go along with racist stuff to the point that you actually internalize that racist stuff and have to unlearn it afterwards. Because I was virtually the only black kid at most of the schools that I went to, so I had a strong incentive to go along with racism, because within racist structures, it can pay off. But let me give you another example to take it away from race for a second. I remember when I was working on the Our Future, Our Choice youth campaign against Brexit, we used to joke about how much easier it would be to be on the other side of the debate, because you could just lie. Because the Brexiteers had abandoned expertise a long time ago, so they didn't have to back up their claims, and every time they lied, we'd then have to spend 3 hours looking for the truth behind that, at which point they'd have lied 3 times more. Not to mention, we'd have got jobs for life. because our age group voted 70% Remain, so finding young faces to counter the narrative that the future of the UK was in the EU was extremely valuable to the Brexiteer campaigns. Which is why you saw faces pop up like Tom Harwood, Darren Grimes, Lucy Harris, Chloe Wesley, and they were all over our TV screens for 3 years. They hadn't got huge social media followings, they weren't experts in EU law or trade or international relations, they were just young and willing to publicly support Brexit. And they made careers out of it. Tom Harwood and Darren Grimes went on to present on GB News. Lucy Harris and Chloe Wesley both got jobs in the Prime Minister's Cabinet Office. And Brexit was clearly going to hurt young people more than any other group because we were going to live with it for the longest. And the government was actively hostile towards young people to the point of literally refusing to let 16-year-olds vote because
we know it'll probably favour one particular party.
So young people were being made poorer, losing our rights like being able to work in other countries and environmental protections, and some of us were being deliberately democratically silenced. So by any definition, young people were being oppressed by the politics of the day. And if you were from that oppressed group and you were willing to contribute to the oppression of the rest of that group, the reward was TV slots and government jobs. You get what I'm saying? Which is why Don Butler then goes on to say,
they get promoted because of the things that they're saying. So you couldn't really have a white Home Secretary saying the sort of things that Suella's saying and get away with it that easily, I don't think. So it's very strategic of the government to place people with those kinds of views and meddling in those positions.
Which makes perfect sense given everything I've said, and yet the right went nuts.
A comment that I believe is actually racist from the Labour MP Dawn Butler.
Okay, and that is actually disgusting. That's probably, since I've been elected, the most awful, disgusting, and it's quite racist thing I have ever seen.
Okay, let's tackle this head on. The United Nations has said that this government is trying to normalise white supremacy after the Tories published a race report that tried to argue that discriminating against people from ethnic minorities might not be racist and that we should look at the positives of the slave trade. They then passed a policing law which they themselves say will disproportionately target black people, but the Home Office says that this is objectively justified. Again, the Tories saying that racism is objectively justified, while at the same time denying the existence of institutional racism, despite it being a matter of governmental record due to the disproportionate use of stop and search and the government's race reports data on employment discrimination. And let's be clear, if you deny that a problem exists, you make it harder to solve that problem. So denying that racism exists, despite clear evidence of racism, is racist. And while Ukrainian refugees were being welcomed into people's homes, Yemeni refugees were being told that they have to go back to Yemen while bombs that were made in the UK were still blowing up hospitals and schools in Yemen. And Suella Braverman was describing largely African and Middle Eastern asylum seekers as invaders, despite being confronted face to face by a literal Holocaust survivor who was begging her to stop. My point is, it's well established that this government has a racist agenda, so if you were running a government and you had a racist agenda and you didn't want to be called racist, would you make your entire cabinet be white? Or would you think that would be stupid? Stupid, right? Which is why when Don Butler says,
it's very strategic of the government to place people with those kinds of views and meddling in those positions.
She's bang on. And Lee Anderson also tries to argue,
This is a Labour Party that will have all in shortlists. They will select and recruit and promote people based on their sex. For this female MP to say that in public, absolutely disgraceful.
I'm trying to make sure that our politicians reflect the populations they represent in terms of gender makeup is not the same as deliberately hiring people from ethnic minorities so that you can be as racist as you want. But the core question is it out of line? Is it some left-wing racist conspiracy theory to say that some people from ethnic minorities are strategically promoted to say racist things that white people can't get away with saying easily? And guess who came to prove Don Butler right? Right-wing GB News commenting, Daily Mail writing Dominique Samuels, a black woman who by her own admission used to blame black people for, quote, giving power to racism by, talking about it. And over the weekend, she blew the whistle on the Daily Mail for drafting an article about the Notting Hill Carnival, which even she considered to be racist, and asking her to say she wrote it. Literally using her for the melanin in her skin to say racist things which they'd find it harder to get away with as white publishers. Which is the exact thing that Don Butler was talking about, not some left-wing conspiracy theory. Total vindication again. She said the people veiling their clear racial prejudice under the guise of culture, making repeated references to animals when responding to videos of black people at the carnival, actually knocked me sick. No longer going to pussyfoot around it anymore, there's some genuine racism in these spaces that I've seen, and I'm no longer willing to associate with it. And today she continued, I will never be aligned with the people that promote hatred or prejudice. I realize that I was at some points, and I apologize. Now she's going through what she describes as a spiritual journey, but nobody can look at this and come to any other conclusion than she was used by the racist and right-wing establishment to attack ethnic minorities, and she's now publicly accepting this. Now of course she's not fully backing down, she's doing that whole both sides thing that Trump did with the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
She's trying to argue that the biggest names who call out racism in the UK are just as bad as the people who are racist, which is obviously a horrendous false equivalence, because as I explained above, institutional racism is a matter of governmental record, so if we don't call it out, it's not going to go anywhere. And for people like Kanye West, Candace Owens, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Kwasi Kwarteng, who by the way, recently vulgarly insulted Kelechi on national TV, which in a normal world would mean you lose your job as an MP. For those people, institutional racism isn't a matter of life and death, so they can choose to ignore it or even facilitate it and it won't affect them that badly. But if you're a working class black woman who's struggling to get a well-paying job because as the government figures show, it's 80% harder with a name like yours, or you're a working class black boy being chased down by police with tasers because you happen to go on a charity bike ride with your father, then yes, this stuff can ruin or end your whole life. But Dominique Samuels is clearly going through a transition. She may find her way out of the sunken place, she might not, but whether she does or doesn't matter because this isn't about her. Just like that Nigerian dude who the BBC found said that Nigerian students are visa cheats. As long as those in power have a racist agenda, there will always be somebody who's willing to push that agenda for clout or just for the bag. Again, a voting system where all votes count equally will go a long way to fixing that problem. And before we finish up, I know there's going to be a lot of people using the word coconut in my comments, i.e. brown on the outside and white on the inside. That term is racially abusive to both black and white people because it implies that some personality traits are strictly reserved to people of one skin color, and anybody with characteristics of the other side is automatically bad. And it strengthens the worst stereotypes about black people by implying we have to live by them, so please don't use that word. Anyway, here's another reminder that I'll be speaking at the National Rejoin March on Saturday the 23rd of September. Be there if you want to stick two fingers up at this government. I'm Femi, have a great week.